The rain had been falling since dawn, the kind that blurred the city skyline into a watercolor of gray and silver. From his office on the 28th floor, Nate Hollis stared out through the glass wall, his reflection superimposed over the drizzle-drenched windows of downtown Seattle. The hum of his phone on the desk broke the quiet, a reminder of schedules, deadlines, numbers, everything that made his world predictable. He liked it that way. Predictability kept him safe. He reached for his coffee, still steaming, and reviewed the weekly reports. Every line on the spreadsheet was a measure of control, profit margins, growth percentages, efficiency ratios. But one email from Human Resources refused to disappear from his mind. It had been marked red 3 times, flagged with an irritating exclamation mark. Employee absence. Domestic staff. Catalina Reyes. 3 days without showing up. No message, no call, no explanation. He had hired Catalina precisely because she wasn't like the others, quiet, reliable, invisible. She arrived at 6 sharp every morning, cleaned without a word, left before he came home. She didn't ask questions. She didn't look at him like a person who wanted something. Until now. He exhaled sharply, irritation tightening his chest. Maybe she'd found another job. Maybe she'd decided he wasn't worth the trouble. He told himself it didn't matter. Still, something about her sudden absence felt personal, and Nate didn't like things that felt personal. He pulled his phone closer, thumb hovering over her contact number. The rain outside seemed to whisper against the glass, urging him to get it over with. He dialed, rehearsing the words in his head, something professional, detached, final. The call rang once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th, a small voice answered. "Hello?" Nate frowned. "Is Catalina there?" There was a pause, followed by a trembling breath. "Sir, please don't hang up. My mom won't wake up, and there's blood on her mouth." The words hit him like a blow to the chest. For a moment, the sounds of the office, the clock ticking, the rain seemed to vanish. His throat tightened. "Who is this?" "I'm Eli," the boy sobbed. "I tried to wake her up like she showed me, but she's really cold." Nate's hand went numb around the phone. The voice was young, maybe 5 or 6, too young to sound that scared. He pushed back his chair, standing so fast it nearly fell over. "Eli, listen to me," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Is your mom breathing?" "I think so, but it sounds weird, like bubbles." The boy's words painted a picture that Nate didn't want to see. His pulse raced, each second sharper than the one before. "Where do you live?" he asked. Eli recited the address with surprising clarity, voice shaking but determined. Nate grabbed his keys, jacket, and wallet in one motion. His assistant called after him from the hallway, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. By the time he reached the parking garage, his thoughts were spinning. He had meant to fire her. He had meant to lecture her about responsibility and professionalism. But now he was driving through sheets of rain with his hazard lights flashing, praying he wasn't too late for a woman he had barely noticed in 4 years. The highway shimmered with reflections of red brake lights and passing trucks. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter with every mile. Somewhere between the towers of downtown and the worn neighborhoods of Tacoma, something in him began to crack, not out of guilt. Not yet, but out of fear. He remembered the way Catalina had always kept her head down, how her hands trembled slightly when she polished the glass table, how she smiled faintly whenever she mentioned her son. He'd never asked his name before. He didn't know she had anyone at home waiting for her. The rain thickened, blurring the road ahead. He switched on the wipers, but the blur remained, as if the city itself refused to let him see clearly until he faced what waited at the end of that drive. The streets grew narrower as he left the main highway, passing rows of small houses leaning against each other under the gray sky. The GPS announced, "You've arrived." But there was nothing elegant about the place it led him to. Just a 2-story building above a tortilla shop, its windows fogged with steam. He parked his BMW at the curb, ignoring the stares from a group of boys sheltering beneath an awning. When he climbed the narrow stairs, the smell of corn and soap mixed with the dampness of the hall. Apartment 3. He knocked once, then again harder. A small click came from inside. The door opened, revealing a boy in an oversized soccer shirt, his eyes swollen and red. "You're Mr. Hollis?" the child asked in a whisper. Nate nodded, trying to keep his voice gentle.
Yes, you must be Eli.
The boy stepped back to let him in. The apartment was barely a room, a mattress on the floor, a curtain separating a tiny kitchen, drawings taped to the wall with the careful pride of a child who owned little else. On the mattress lay Catalina. She was pale, her lips cracked, a faint trace of dried blood at the corner of her mouth. For the first time in years, Nate knelt on the floor. He touched her wrist. Her pulse was weak, but there. "Eli, get me a towel," he said. The boy rushed to obey, small feet slapping against the tile. Nate wiped the blood carefully, his throat tightening as he saw the bruised marks on her thin arms. "She was coughing all night," Eli said, clutching the towel. "I tried to make her tea, but she couldn't drink it." Nate swallowed the ache in his chest. "You did good, son. You did exactly what you should." He pulled out his phone and called 911, his voice shaking only once when he gave the address. The dispatcher's calm tone steadied him. Within minutes, the distant wail of sirens broke through the steady hum of rain. Nate looked around the room again, no food on the counter, a single pair of shoes by the door, a backpack with a frayed zipper. How had he missed all this? For 4 years, she'd worked in his spotless apartment while living in a place like this, hiding her exhaustion behind quiet smiles. The paramedics arrived quickly, their boots splashing through puddles as they carried in equipment. Nate stayed close, answering questions he barely understood. "Employer," he heard himself say, though the word sounded wrong. It felt cold, unfit for what this moment had become. As they lifted Catalina onto a stretcher, Eli clung to her hand until a medic gently pulled him back. The boy's tears mixed with rainwater, leaving streaks on his cheeks. "Can I go with her?" he asked, his voice cracking. Nate crouched down to meet his eyes. "We'll follow her together, okay? You're not alone now." Eli nodded, gripping Nate's sleeve as they descended the stairs. The smell of fresh tortillas rose from below, oddly comforting amid the chaos. Outside, the ambulance lights painted the wet street in flashes of red and blue. Nate opened the car door for the boy, helped him buckle the seatbelt, then watched as the ambulance pulled away, siren fading into the distance. He sat behind the wheel for a moment, rain drumming on the windshield. The city that once felt like his kingdom suddenly looked vast and indifferent. He didn't know why his hands trembled, or why the sight of that small boy in his passenger seat filled him with both terror and something else, something fierce and unfamiliar. Eli's head drooped against the window, exhaustion pulling him toward sleep. Nate glanced at the child's reflection in the glass, tiny fingers curled into a fist, face streaked with tears, and felt a quiet, unfamiliar vow rise in him. When the light turned green, he followed the ambulance through the wet streets of Tacoma, headlights cutting a path through the rain. He told himself he was only making sure his employee survived. But deep down, under the thrum of the engine and the sound of the storm, a different truth whispered its way into his heart. He was driving towards something he didn't yet understand, and there would be no turning back. The rain didn't let up as the ambulance sped through the streets of Tacoma. Its siren echoed off the wet pavement, cutting through the night like a cry. Nate followed close behind, headlights carving shaky lines of white across the slick asphalt. Every few seconds, the red glow from the ambulance lights flashed across his windshield, strobing against his face. Beside him, Eli sat motionless, hugging a faded, stuffed bear that had been in his backpack. His small fingers gripped the toy so tightly that the seams looked ready to burst. He hadn't said a word since they left the apartment. "You okay back there?" Nate asked quietly. The boy nodded without looking up. His voice was small. "Will she die?" Nate swallowed, hands tightening on the steering wheel. "The doctors will help her. They'll do everything they can." It wasn't much of an answer, but it was the only truth he had. The hospital came into view, a square of light against the storm, the words Tacoma General glowing in blue. He parked crookedly near the emergency entrance and ran around to open Eli's door. The rain hit hard, sharp as needles, soaking through his coat within seconds. He guided the boy inside, where the fluorescent lights burned too bright after the darkness outside. The air smelled of antiseptic and coffee gone cold. Nurses moved quickly, pushing gurneys and calling out names. Somewhere a monitor beeped in a steady rhythm, unnervingly calm. They were told to wait. "She's in triage," a nurse said, her voice brisk but not unkind. "You can't see her yet." Nate sat with Eli in the corner of the waiting area. The child's shoes squished when he moved his feet. Someone had left a stack of magazines on the table, Christmas issues from last year, their pages curling at the edges. Eli flipped one open, staring at a picture of a family decorating a tree. He touched the image gently, as if the people inside could hear him. "Do you have kids?" he asked suddenly, eyes still on the magazine. Nate hesitated. "No," he said after a moment. "I never did." The boy nodded, as if that explained everything. Then he whispered, "Mom says you're a big boss, like on TV." That drew a quiet breath of surprise from Nate. "She said that?" Eli nodded again. "She said you're good at fixing things, that you make broken places work again." Nate looked away, the words cutting closer than they should have. For a man who prided himself on fixing what was broken, he'd never once looked past his own walls to see who might be crumbling beneath them. Time stretched. The rain softened to a hush against the windows. A nurse finally approached with a clipboard. "Are you family?" she asked. Nate opened his mouth, but the words caught. He wasn't family. He was her employer, a man who'd barely known her life outside of his apartment. And yet, as he glanced at the boy beside him, trembling and half asleep, the answer that came felt truer than anything he'd said in years. "Yes," he heard himself say quietly. "We're family." The nurse studied him for a long second, then nodded. "She's stable for now," she said, "but we'll need someone to stay with the child. Social services will arrive in the morning." Nate thanked her, voice low. When she walked away, he noticed the way Eli leaned against him without hesitation, head resting against his arm. The boy's breathing slowed, uneven but peaceful, and Nate felt the unfamiliar weight of being needed, heavy, terrifying, and strangely right. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The city lights shimmered on the wet streets like scattered stars. And for the first time in years, Nate didn't feel entirely alone. By morning, the storm had passed. A pale, washed-out light filled the hospital corridor, catching on the waxed floors and the chrome of wheelchairs lined against the wall. The scent of disinfectant lingered, mixed with the faint aroma of burnt coffee from the vending machine. Nate hadn't slept. He sat on the plastic chair beside Eli, who was curled up with his head resting against Nate's jacket. Every so often, the boy would stir, whispering for his mother, and Nate would gently place a hand on his shoulder until he drifted off again. He watched the nurses begin their shifts, watched the world resume its pace while his own felt suspended in amber. Catalina was still in critical care. Pneumonia, they said. Complications, exhaustion, maybe a week of recovery if her body held on. When the doors slid open with a hiss, a woman in a gray blazer walked in, holding a tablet and a calm professional smile. "Good morning. I'm Officer Karen Dunn, Child Services," she said. Her tone was polite but carried the kind of authority that left no room for misunderstanding. "You must be Mr. Hollis." He stood, straightening his tie as though it mattered. "Yes." She nodded toward the boy. "This is Eli?" Nate glanced down. "He's been with me since last night." Karen studied them both. "You understand that until we contact the next of kin, custody of the child remains under state supervision." The words felt cold, official, like they belonged to another world. Nate nodded slowly. "I just didn't want him to be alone." "That was the right thing to do," she said, her voice softening. "We're grateful you stayed." She crouched beside Eli and introduced herself in a warm tone, asking simple questions: his name, his age, whether he'd had breakfast. The boy answered politely, still half asleep, his trust unwavering. When Karen stepped aside to make a few calls, Nate wandered to the window. Outside, the city looked cleaner somehow. The rain had scrubbed away the grime from rooftops, and a thin beam of sunlight cut through the clouds. For the first time in years, he felt the strange, fragile possibility of something new. A doctor approached with a clipboard. "Miss Alvarez is stable but unconscious," he said. "We've moved her to intensive care. Her condition could improve with rest and medication. You can visit for a few minutes if you'd like." Nate hesitated. He didn't know what he would say to her. There were no words that could bridge the distance of 4 silent years, the polite nods, the casual ignorance, the missed chances to ask if she was okay. When he finally entered the ICU, Catalina looked impossibly small beneath the hospital sheets. Machines breathed for her, beeping softly in rhythm. Her hair was damp against her forehead, her hands motionless. He reached out, touching the edge of the blanket. "You didn't deserve this," he murmured, the words surprising even him. "You worked harder than anyone I know, and I never noticed." He stood there for a long time, the steady sound of the heart monitor filling the silence. Outside the room, Eli waited with Officer Dunn. When Nate stepped out, the boy looked up hopefully. "Can we go home now?" he asked. Nate glanced at Karen. She gave a small nod. "You can take him for now," she said. "Just until we finish the paperwork. I'll check in later today." The boy slipped his hand into Nate's, small and warm, trusting. It startled him how natural it felt. They walked through the hospital's sliding doors, the morning air cool against their faces. The sky had cleared to a pale blue, and the puddles reflected bits of it like fragments of a larger sky. Nate unlocked his car, opened the passenger door, and helped Eli climb in. For a brief second, as he looked at the boy fastening his seatbelt with sleepy determination, something inside Nate softened a quiet crack in the armor he'd worn for years. He started the engine. "We'll get you something to eat," he said. "How do you feel about pancakes?" Eli smiled for the first time since the night before, the expression small but real. "Mom says pancakes fix everything." Nate looked at him, and for once, didn't correct the hope in those words. As they pulled onto the highway, sunlight spilled through the clouds, lighting the wet asphalt ahead. The boy hummed softly beside him, and for the first time in a long while, Nate didn't feel like he was driving toward another empty day. He was heading somewhere unfamiliar, somewhere that might just begin to feel like home. Hospitals have a strange kind of quiet one that hums beneath the surface, full of machines breathing for people who cannot. 3 days had passed since the storm, but for Nate Hollis, time had become elastic. Each morning bled into the next, measured only by the beeping of monitors and the smell of disinfectant that clung to his clothes, no matter how many times he changed. He had promised Eli they would visit early. The boy was sitting cross-legged in the waiting lounge, drawing on a stack of hospital menu papers with a stubby pencil. His lines were simple but full of life-smiling faces. A woman with long hair, a tall man with a cup of coffee. When Nate leaned closer, he realized the tall man wore his suit. "Who's that?" he asked, pointing to the little figure. Eli looked up, unbothered. "That's you," he said. "You're standing next to us." The words caught Nate off guard. He tried to smile, but something in his chest pulled tight. He hadn't stood next to anyone. In years he had stood above them, apart from them, but never next to. Catalina was still unconscious. The doctor said her lungs were weak, the infection stubborn. Nate had quietly arranged for a private room and paid the bills before social services could intervene. Money, for once, wasn't about control. It was the only way he knew to apologize. He entered her room alone that afternoon. The blinds were half drawn, letting in strips of watery sunlight that crossed her bed like faded ribbons. Her breathing was shallow, steady. Beside her lay a small plastic cup with melted ice, a reminder of effort that hadn't worked. He sat down, fingers tapping against his knee. "I never thanked you," he said quietly, "for everything you did all those years." The words felt awkward, but real. He remembered the mornings she'd arrived early, the smell of lemon cleaner, the faint hum of her Spanish songs under her breath. He had thought of them as background noise then, just part of the rhythm of his efficient, sterile life. Now he realized how human those sounds had been. He stayed longer than he intended. Sometimes he read from a magazine, pretending she could hear. Other times he just watched the slow rise and fall of her chest. By evening, Eli joined him, holding a small paper cup of juice. "She looks better," the boy whispered. "She does," Nate agreed, though he wasn't sure it was true. Eli placed his cup on the bedside table and climbed into the chair beside his mother. He reached for her hand, his tiny fingers wrapping around hers. "Mom, I'm here," he said softly. "And Mr. Hollis, too." Nate's throat tightened. The boy spoke with such calm certainty, as if his presence could pull her back by will alone. For a fleeting second, Nate wished it were possible, wished love could be that strong. A nurse peeked in to check Catalina's vitals. "She's holding steady," she said, glancing at Nate. "It's good for her to hear familiar voices. Keeps the mind anchored." After she left, the room returned to its hush. The only sound was the boy's breathing and the steady hum of the oxygen machine. Nate found himself talking again, almost without realizing. "You know," he said, voice low, When I was little, my mom worked nights. She used to come home so tired she'd fall asleep at the kitchen table. I remember thinking adults were made of stone, that they never broke. Eli's eyes lifted to him. Do you think my mom will break? Nate swallowed hard. No, he said after a pause. I think she's the strongest person I've ever met. The boy nodded, satisfied, and leaned against the armrest. He fell asleep not long after, his small hand still resting on his mother's. Nate adjusted the blanket around him, the gesture instinctive, natural. When he looked back at Catalina, her fingers twitched ever so slightly beneath her son's hand. The monitor's rhythm shifted barely, but enough for him to notice. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to hope. The night crept in quietly, folding itself around the hospital like a blanket of silence. The overhead lights dimmed, and the rhythmic hum of machines became the only heartbeat the room had. Outside the window, the city glowed faintly, pockets of yellow light scattered across Tacoma's hills, softened by the mist. Nate sat by the bed, his jacket draped over the chair, his tie loosened. Eli was asleep again on the couch, his small body curled beneath a borrowed blanket. The child's soft breathing rose and fell, keeping time with the slow, mechanical sigh of the ventilator. For hours, Nate said nothing. He only listened to the sound of life continuing in fragile increments. Every beep and hiss felt like a reminder of how easily he had almost missed this, how blind success had made him to everything that truly mattered. He thought about the years he'd spent building walls made of numbers and appointments, of how people like Catalina had quietly kept those walls standing. He'd always assumed gratitude was something you paid for with money, with bonuses, with polite thanks. But sitting here, watching her fight for breath, he realized gratitude was not a transaction. It was something you owed with your heart. At some point past midnight, a soft movement broke his thoughts. Catalina's hand shifted slightly under the blanket. Nate froze. Her eyelids fluttered open, slow and heavy. Catalina? His voice was barely a whisper. Her lips moved, cracked and dry. Eli. He's here, Nate said quickly, leaning closer. He's safe, sleeping right there. She tried to turn her head toward the boy, but the effort was too much. Tears welled at the corners of her eyes, slipping down her temples. Nate reached for a tissue, wiping them gently. Her skin was warm now, not cold like that night. I thought I wouldn't see him again, she murmured. You will, he said softly. You're getting better. The doctors. She shook her head faintly, eyes unfocused. I heard your voice, she whispered. You were calling my name. He blinked, startled. You heard that? In my dream, she said, a fragile smile crossing her lips. You sounded scared. The honesty in her words disarmed him. He wanted to deny it, but he couldn't. I was, he admitted. I still am. Her gaze lingered on him for a moment, weak but full of quiet understanding. Take care of him, she whispered. Promise me. The monitor beeped steadily beside them. Nate felt his chest tighten, as though the air itself had thickened. You'll take care of him yourself, he said. But his voice broke on the last word. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried years of acceptance. Her eyes drifted closed again, the tension easing from her face. Nate sat there long after the nurses had checked her vitals and dimmed the lights again. He didn't move, afraid to break the fragile peace that filled the room. The boy stirred on the couch, murmuring something in his sleep, something that sounded like Dad. Nate looked over, frozen. Eli's small hand was reaching out unconsciously, fingers curling toward the empty air. For a long moment, Nate just watched him, unable to breathe. He reached out slowly, letting the boy's fingers wrap around his own. They were warm, trusting, and impossibly small. The word still echoed in his head. Dad, heavy, impossible, yet somehow right. Outside, the first light of dawn brushed against the horizon, turning the edges of the clouds to gold. Nate didn't notice the sunrise. He was still sitting there, holding the child's hand, realizing that something inside him had shifted forever and that he was no longer the man he had been 3 days ago. The smell of butter and coffee filled the air, mingling with the faint sound of rain tapping against the diner windows. It was one of those gray Seattle mornings that blurred time when the city moved slowly, wrapped in fog and routine. Nate sat in a corner booth, watching the steam rise from his cup as Eli studied the menu with exaggerated seriousness. The boy's legs dangled above the floor, swinging back and forth, his shoes tapping against the chrome seat. They have chocolate pancakes, Eli said, eyes wide. And blueberry ones, too. Which one's your favorite? Nate hesitated. It had been years since anyone had asked him a question that simple. I suppose I don't have one. Eli frowned as if that were unacceptable. Everyone has a favorite, he said matter-of-factly, then closed the menu with a decisive clap. We'll get both. We can share. The waitress, an older woman with silver hair tied up in a bun, chuckled as she came by with a notepad. That's a fine idea, sweetheart, she said to Eli. Then, turning to Nate, she added, You look like a man who hasn't slept in days. Coffee's on the house today. Nate smiled faintly, surprised by her kindness. Thank you, he said, and meant it. As they waited for their food, Eli talked about school, about the drawings he liked to make, about his mom teaching him how to count using grocery receipts. His words came out in bursts, bright and sincere, filling the quiet space between them that used to make Nate uncomfortable. When the pancakes arrived, stacked high and dripping with syrup, Eli pushed the plate toward him. You have to take the first bite, he insisted. Nate laughed softly. That's your rule? It's Mom's rule, Eli said, his tone turning gentle. She says when you share food, you share love. The fork paused halfway to Nate's mouth. He looked at the boy, this small, earnest soul, who still believed the world worked that way, and felt something inside him loosen. He took a bite, the sweetness surprising him. Not bad, he said. Eli grinned. Told you, pancakes fix everything. They ate in companionable silence for a while. Outside, the rain began to fade, and a sliver of sunlight slipped through the clouds, scattering gold across the table. Nate found himself watching Eli more than he meant, to the way his curls caught the light, the way he spoke with his hands, animated and fearless. After breakfast, they stopped by a small toy store on the way to the hospital. Nate hadn't planned it, but when Eli's eyes lit up at the sight of a box of crayons, he didn't think twice. Pick one, he said, just one. Eli studied the shelf carefully, then reached for a simple 24-pack instead of the giant one on display. This one's enough, he said. Nate frowned. Why not the big one? Because Mom says if you take too much, you can't carry it all, Eli replied, shrugging. Nate couldn't help but smile. Your mom sounds very wise. She is. They walked out of the store together, the boy skipping slightly, clutching the crayons like treasure. For the first time, Nate felt something close to peace, a strange, quiet sense of belonging that had nothing to do with money or success. He didn't notice the stares of passers-by or the calls from his office that went unanswered. For once, the world could wait. That afternoon, they returned to the hospital. Catalina was still asleep, her condition unchanged, but the nurses smiled when Eli handed them a drawing, a bright crayon picture of 3 stick figures under a sundae, one tall, one small, one lying in bed, all connected by a red line shaped like a heart. When Nate saw it, he felt his throat tighten. That's beautiful, he said quietly. Eli nodded. It's us, he said simply. Mom, me, and you. Nate didn't know what to say. He just kept looking at the picture, the little red heart between them, and wondered how something drawn by a child could carry more truth than anything he'd built his whole life. By the time they reached Nate's apartment, the city had gone quiet again. The rain had softened into a mist that clung to the streets, reflecting the faint amber of streetlights. Eli held his crayon box close as they stepped out of the elevator, his shoes squeaking against the polished floor. The penthouse felt different now, less like a museum, more like a place waiting to be lived in. Nate hadn't noticed the emptiness before. The perfect symmetry of the furniture, the untouched books, the silence that filled every corner. But with Eli standing there, wide-eyed and small beneath the high ceilings, the silence felt almost embarrassed. Whoa, Eli whispered, spinning slowly to take it all in. It's so big. Nate smiled faintly. It's just home, he said, though it had never really been one. He led the boy to the guest room, the same one he'd hastily prepared days earlier. The bed was neatly made, the blanket folded at the foot. He had even placed a small lamp on the nightstand, its warm light spilling across the white sheets. Eli walked over, running his fingers along the edge of the blanket. It smells like new, he said, scrunching his nose. That's because no one's ever used it, Nate replied. The boy glanced up at him. Then maybe it's been waiting for me. Nate froze. the words sinking deep. For a second, he couldn't speak. "Maybe it has," he said softly. He watched as Eli unpacked his crayons on the desk and began to draw without hesitation. The sound of pencil against paper was comforting, steady. When the boy finished, he held up the drawing. A house with windows glowing yellow and 3 figures standing by a door. "This one's for Mom," he said, "so she knows where I am." Nate took the drawing carefully, smoothing the paper between his fingers. "She'll love it," he said, his voice rough. "We'll show it to her tomorrow." Later, they had grilled cheese sandwiches for dinner. Nate found himself burning the first 2, and Eli giggled so hard he nearly dropped his milk.
"You're worse than my mom in the kitchen,"
he teased. "I'll take that as motivation to improve," Nate replied, trying not to laugh. When the dishes were done, they settled in the living room. Nate pulled a blanket from the couch and handed it to Eli. The boy curled up, still holding the crayon box like a treasure chest. "Mom used to tell me a story every night," he said. "But you can tell me anything, even about boring grown-up stuff." Nate smiled. "Boring grown-up stuff, huh?" He thought for a moment, then began softly. "Once upon a time, there was a man who forgot how to smile. He thought he was too busy. But one day, a little boy showed him how." Eli's eyelids fluttered. "Did the man say thank you?" "Not yet," Nate said. "He's still learning how." Within minutes, the boy was asleep, his breathing slow and even. Nate sat beside him, the flicker of the city lights spilling across the room. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the urge to check his phone or read reports. The quiet didn't bother him anymore. It felt right. He walked to the window and looked out at the skyline. The rain had stopped completely. Below, the streets shimmered like wet ribbons under the moonlight. He thought of Catalina, her faint smile, her whispered plea, "Take care of him." Turning back, he saw Eli sleeping soundly, one small hand resting on the drawing he'd made. Something inside Nate shifted again so gently he almost didn't notice. He whispered into the room, "You're safe here, kiddo. I promise." The words hung in the air, quiet and steady, like a vow that had waited years to be spoken. And somewhere deep inside, in the silence that followed, the walls of his loneliness began to crack, not with pain, but with warmth. The next few days unfolded like a quiet rhythm Nate hadn't known he missed. Mornings began with the smell of toast and laughter echoing through the kitchen, sounds that had never belonged to his life before. Eli had a way of filling the apartment with movement. Even his footsteps carried light into the rooms that had once been only echoes. They'd visit Catalina each afternoon at the hospital. Her strength was returning slowly, though her voice remained soft, her smile fragile. Every time she looked at Eli, something in her eyes glowed hope mixed with exhaustion, gratitude laced with fear. Nate noticed the way she squeezed her son's hand before they left each day, as if afraid he might vanish again. He had started rearranging his schedule, something no one at the office believed possible. His assistant Megan had called twice, reminding him about investor meetings. He simply replied, "Handle them," and hung up. For once, business could wait. That Thursday, after dropping Eli off at the daycare the hospital had arranged, Nate stopped at a small coffee shop across from the park. The owner, an older man with a gravelly voice and a white apron, recognized him from earlier visits. "You're the guy who always orders decaf but never finishes it," the man joked. Nate smiled. "Guess I'm predictable." "Predictable's not bad," the man said, pouring coffee. "Means life's steady." Steady. It was a word Nate hadn't thought of in years. His life had always been fast, loud, and transactional. But lately, the quiet suited him. He'd even started keeping change in his pocket for the tip jar, something the old Nate would have found unnecessary. He was halfway through his muffin when his phone buzzed on the table. Unknown number. He almost ignored it, then answered out of habit. "Mr. Hollis." The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, rough, slurred slightly, with a kind of forced politeness that didn't sit right. "You don't know me, but I believe you've been spending time with my boy." Nate's chest tightened. "I'm sorry, who is this?" "The kid, Eli, my son." He froze. The noise of the cafe faded until all he could hear was the low rasp of the man's breathing. "This isn't a good time," Nate said carefully. "Oh, I think it is," the man replied. "See, I just found out some rich fella's playing daddy while I was handling some stuff. Thought maybe we should talk about what that's worth to you." The line went silent for a heartbeat too long. Nate's jaw tightened. "If you're trying to threaten me—" "Not threaten," the man interrupted. "Negotiate." The call ended abruptly. Nate stared at the phone, the cold weight of anger and dread settling in his stomach. For a long moment, he sat motionless, the world outside the window blurring into meaningless motion. When he finally stood, the coffee had gone cold. That evening, back at the hospital, he tried to hide his unease. Eli was busy showing Catalina a paper crown he'd made from magazine scraps. "Mr. Nate says I can wear it anywhere," the boy said proudly. Catalina smiled faintly. "You look like a prince, Carino." Nate forced a smile. He earned it. Best helper in town. But inside, his thoughts were circling like storm clouds. He didn't want to worry her, not yet, not until he knew who that man really was and what he wanted. As they were leaving, a nurse approached with a clipboard. "Mr. Hollis, there's someone in the lobby asking for you. Said it's urgent." His first thought was of his office, maybe Megan again, or an impatient client. But when he reached the lobby, the smell of alcohol hit him before recognition did. A man in a faded leather jacket was leaning against the reception desk, unshaven, restless, his eyes, bloodshot, calculating, lifted when Nate approached. "So you're the guy," he said, straightening. "Didn't expect you to come down yourself." Nate studied him carefully. The man's posture was confident, but underneath, he could see the cracks, shaking fingers, the twitch of a jaw unused to manners. "You must be Ricardo," he said evenly. "Guess she mentioned me," the man sneered. "Yeah, I'm the father. Been a rough couple of months. But now that I'm back, I figure it's time to see my boy." Nate kept his voice calm, his heartbeat anything but. Catalina's not in a condition for visitors, and Eli's fine where he is. Ricardo's grin widened. "Oh, I'm sure he is. Fancy penthouse, new toys, probably eating better than ever. Must be nice to have a rich man take interest." He leaned closer, his breath sour. "But nothing's free, right? So why don't we make this simple? You keep the kid for now, and I forget about all those pesky custody rights. For a price." Nate's hands clenched at his sides. He wanted to walk away, to ignore him, but he couldn't. Not with Eli upstairs, innocent and unaware. "I don't negotiate with people who use children as leverage," Nate said coldly. Ricardo's smile faltered, replaced by something darker. "Then maybe I'll just talk to the hospital staff. Or the press. Local businessman hides woman's kid in secret apartment. That'll look good, won't it?" Before Nate could respond, a voice interrupted behind them. "Is there a problem here, sir?" The security guard had stepped closer, reading the tension instantly. Ricardo straightened his jacket. "None at all," he said smoothly. "Just an old friend checking in." As he turned to leave, he shot Nate a look that promised this wasn't over. Nate stood frozen, watching him disappear into the night beyond the glass doors. For the first time since Catalina collapsed, fear twisted into something sharper resolve. Because now it wasn't just about guilt or duty. Someone wanted to take that little boy away, and Nate Hollis wasn't going to let that happen. That night, the rain came back hard, drumming against the tall windows of Nate's apartment like restless fingers. The city below blurred into streaks of silver and orange. Inside, the quiet felt heavier than usual. Eli was coloring at the coffee table, humming softly to himself, unaware of the storm both inside and out. His small voice rose and fell with the rhythm of his crayons. "Mom says rain means God is cleaning the sky," he said without looking up. Nate, standing by the window, forced a smile. Then he must be doing a thorough job tonight. And he'd spent the last hour on the phone with a lawyer he trusted, a man named Douglas Ward, who had handled his company's contracts for years. But this was no business call. "You're saying the biological father can make a claim even after years of absence?" Nate asked, pacing. Ward's voice came through steady, professional. "He can try. But if there's documented abuse or neglect, it changes everything. Especially if Catalina gives consent for guardianship." "Consent," Nate repeated quietly. "She's still recovering." Then we start gathering proof. Hospital reports, social services records anything that shows who's truly been there for the child. Mr. Hollis, I'll be honest. Men like him don't stop with one phone call. Be ready. When the call ended, Nate sat in silence, watching the reflection of the city lights flicker across the glass. For years, he'd lived his life by numbers, shares, profits, growth charts. Everything could be controlled, predicted, bought. But this was something no contract could secure. He turned back toward the living room. Eli was asleep now, head resting on his folded arms, crayons scattered across the table. One small hand still clutched the red crayon, the same color he always used for hearts. Nate knelt beside him, gently lifting him into his arms. The boy stirred but didn't wake, his head settling against Nate's shoulder as naturally as if it had always belonged there. He carried him to bed, tucked him in, then lingered at the doorway longer than he meant to. There was a warmth in the room that reminded him of something he hadn't felt since childhood, a sense of purpose that no success had ever given him. The next morning, Catalina was sitting up when he arrived at the hospital. Her color had improved, but her expression tightened the moment she saw his face. "Something happened," she said quietly. He didn't answer right away. He pulled up a chair, his jaw set. Ricardo came by. Her eyes widened, fear replacing the fragile peace she'd fought so hard to hold. "No, Nate, please tell me he didn't see Eli." "He didn't," Nate said. "But he knows where we are, and he wants money to stay away." Catalina turned away, tears forming. "He's never going to change," she whispered. "That man, he only comes back when he needs something." Nate reached across the table, his voice firm but calm. "You don't have to face him anymore. I'll handle it." "You can't fix everything with money," she said softly, looking at him. "Sometimes the only thing people like him understand is pain. And I don't want Eli near that ever again." Nate's throat tightened. "Then let me help you protect him." She met his eyes, something raw and hesitant flickering there. "Do you really care about him, Nate? About my son?" There was no hesitation in his answer. "He's not just your son anymore," he said. He's part of me now." For a moment, the hospital room seemed to fall away, leaving only those words hanging between them, true, unpolished, irreversible. Catalina covered her face with her hands, silent tears sliding down her cheeks. That night, when Nate returned home, he found Eli sitting by the window, still in his pajamas. The boy looked up as soon as the door opened. "Mr. Nate?" he asked softly. "Were you talking about me?" Nate froze. "What do you mean, buddy?" "I heard you on the phone," Eli said, voice trembling. "You said someone wants to take me away." Nate walked over slowly, kneeling beside him. Hey! Look at me. You're safe, okay? No one's going to take you anywhere." But what if they do?" Eli's lip quivered. "They always come back. Bad people always come back." Nate swallowed hard, realizing the boy's fear wasn't new, it was memory. The kind of fear that never really left a child who had seen too much. He placed a hand on Eli's shoulder, gentle but firm. "Listen to me. I made you a promise, remember? I said you're safe here, and I don't break promises." The boy stared at him, eyes wet but searching. "Are you going to leave me too?" The question cut through Nate like a blade. For a second, he couldn't breathe. He thought of all the years he'd spent leaving relationships, leaving people, leaving everything that made him human in pursuit of something hollow. He shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, Eli. Not this time. I'm staying." The boy studied his face, then climbed into his lap and wrapped his small arms around his neck. Nate held him close, his eyes stinging with something that felt like both sorrow and grace. Outside, the storm was still raging. But inside that quiet apartment, something stronger than fear took root. Trust. Fragile, trembling, but real. And for Nate Hollis, that was the beginning of everything he'd never known he needed. A week later, the sky over Seattle had turned a clean, crisp blue, the kind that follows days of rain, when everything feels freshly washed but not yet settled. Nate sat in the conference room of Douglas Ward's law office, his reflection faint in the glass wall behind him. Stacks of papers sat neatly on the table, but nothing about this meeting felt businesslike. Catalina sat beside him, her hair tied back, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked stronger now, but her eyes carried that same quiet worry that never seemed to leave. Douglas, a man in his 60s with steady hands and a voice that carried authority without arrogance, adjusted his glasses. "We've reviewed the case," he began. "Ricardo Mendoza has no legal grounds for custody. His record shows multiple arrests, a restraining order, and a documented history of neglect. However, he hesitated, glancing at Nate. However, Nate asked. Public perception, Douglas said simply. He's already contacted a small local paper. He's telling them that you, mister, Hollis used your wealth to take another man's child. Catalina's hands trembled. He's lying, she said softly. He doesn't care about Eli. He never did. I know, Douglas said kindly. But people believe stories that sound dramatic, especially when a rich man's involved. We'll counter it. The truth always wins, but only if we stay steady. Nate exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. He'd handled media storms before, rumors, leaks, even lawsuits, but this was different. This wasn't about his company's reputation. It was about a little boy who drew hearts in red crayon and believed promises with all his might. I'll face whatever comes, he said finally. Just tell me what I need to do. Catalina looked at him, searching. Why are you doing all this, Nate? She asked quietly. You've already done more than anyone could expect. He turned toward her, his expression soft but unwavering. Because I can't unhear that phone call. The one from Eli. The fear in his voice. It changed something in me. She didn't answer, but tears welled in her eyes. Later that afternoon, Nate and Douglas drove to the county courthouse to file for emergency guardianship, an act that would protect Eli from being taken until a full hearing could be arranged. The courthouse sat on a hill overlooking the Sound, its gray facade stark against the pale light. Inside, everything smelled faintly of paper and old wood polish. Families waited on benches. Lawyers whispered in corners, the air thick with unspoken stories. As they signed the documents, Douglas looked up. You understand this isn't just temporary, right? Once we start this process, you're stepping into his life permanently. It's not something you can half finish. Nate met his gaze. I know. I'm not walking away. That evening, back at the apartment, Eli sat cross-legged on the floor, building a tower out of wooden blocks. Each piece was slightly crooked. Yet he seemed to take pride in its imperfections. Look, he said as Nate came in. It's a castle. Nate crouched beside him. It's impressive. Who lives there? Me and Mom, Eli said confidently. Then, after a pause, and you. The answer caught Nate off guard. He blinked, feeling the room grow warmer somehow. That's quite an honor, he said softly. You have to promise not to let it fall, Eli added, balancing another block on top. If you touch it too hard, it breaks. Nate smiled. I'll be careful. As they played, he thought about Douglas's warning about permanence, about what it meant to truly belong to someone. Every laugh from the boy, every small hand that reached for his, made that choice feel less like responsibility and more like destiny. When Eli finally fell asleep on the couch, Nate sat in the half-light, watching the city outside. He realized the tower of blocks still stood, perfectly crooked but steady like everything fragile he was learning to protect. Then his phone buzzed. A message. Unknown number again. Nice try, Mr. Hollis. But paper can't keep blood apart forever. His stomach sank. He knew the tone Ricardo wasn't done. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly over the Sound, and Nate glanced toward Eli, asleep and peaceful. He whispered to himself, over my dead body. And for the first time in his life, those words didn't come from pride. They came from love. The courthouse smelled faintly of rain-soaked coats and freshly brewed coffee. Families shuffled through the long hallways, clutching folders, tissues, or one another's hands. For Nate, it wasn't the marble floors or the echoing ceilings that felt heavy, it was the waiting. Catalina sat beside him on the wooden bench, outside courtroom 2 Amperes. She wore a simple navy dress, her hair pinned neatly. Beside her, Eli held onto his crayon box, his fingers worrying the corner of the cardboard. Nate wished he could take that fear from him, fold it up, and throw it away. Douglas Ward approached with quiet efficiency. They're ready for us, he said, voice calm but purposeful. Remember, stay composed. Facts win cases, not tempers. Inside, the courtroom was small but crowded. A single window let in a cold light that fell directly over the plaintiff's table where Ricardo Mendoza sat, leaning back in his chair, wearing a wrinkled shirt and a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. Nate felt Catalina's hand tremble beside him as they took their seats. The judge, a woman in her late 50s with steady gray eyes, looked over the file before her. This hearing concerns the temporary guardianship of Eli Mendoza Reyes, she began. All parties present? Douglas stood. For the petitioner, Mr. Nathan Hollis and Miss Catalina Reyes, the child's mother. A young public defender rose beside Ricardo. For the respondent, Mr. Ricardo Mendoza. The judge nodded. Proceed. M. Douglas started calmly, laying out the facts. Ricardo's history of violence, his absence, the restraining orders, Catalina's medical condition, and Nate's role in caring for Eli. He spoke not as a man trying to win, but as someone presenting a truth too clear to deny. When it was Ricardo's turn, he leaned forward theatrically. Your Honor, I'm a changed man. I made mistakes, sure, but I'm still his father. And this rich guy, he gestured toward Nate, he's just trying to buy what I lost. Catalina's face tightened. Nate could feel the anger rising in his chest, but Douglas rested a warning hand on his arm. Ricardo went on, weaving half-truths with practiced ease. He painted himself as a victim, unemployed, misunderstood, robbed of his family by circumstance, but his eyes betrayed him. Every time he said my son, they darted away. The judge listened, expression unreadable. When Douglas called Catalina to speak, she hesitated before standing. Her voice shook at first, but steadied with each word. Your Honor, I don't have fancy words. I only know what's true. That man, she gestured toward Ricardo, left us. He left when our son was 2, and every time he came back, it was to hurt, not to help. She paused, swallowing hard. Mr. Hollis didn't steal my child. He saved him. When I was sick, he was there. When Eli was scared, he stayed. I don't have much in this world, but I know the kind of man I want my son to become. And he's learning that now from someone who shows him kindness every single day. For a moment, the courtroom went still. Even the judge's pen stopped moving. Ricardo scoffed under his breath. She's just saying that because he's got money. Then, unexpectedly, a small voice broke through the silence. That's not true. All heads turned. Eli was standing beside the bench, clutching his crayon box to his chest. His voice was small but clear. Mr. Nate's not trying to take me. He just wants me to be safe. He reads me stories. He makes pancakes. He never yells. The bailiff moved as if to guide him back, but the judge raised a hand, stopping her. Let him speak. Eli took a shaky breath. My real dad makes Mom cry. Mr. Nate doesn't. So, I want to stay with him. Please. The room fell into a silence that seemed to stretch forever. Ricardo looked away, color draining from his face. Catalina pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, tears spilling freely. The judge finally spoke, voice firm but gentle. Thank you, Eli. That was very brave. She turned her gaze toward both tables. Given the testimony and the evidence presented, the court will place the child under temporary guardianship of Mr. Hollis, pending further review. We'll reconvene in 2 weeks for a final ruling. A gavel struck. One sharp sound that seemed to echo straight through Nate's chest. Ricardo shot to his feet. You can't do this, he barked. He's not even family. Emser. The bailiff stepped forward, and the judge's tone turned icy. Mr. Mendoza, sit down before I hold you in contempt. Ricardo's defiance faltered. He glared once at Nate, a look full of venom, and then slumped into his chair. As everyone began to file out, Nate turned to see Eli tugging at his sleeve. The boy looked up at him, eyes shining with both fear and relief. Did we win? He whispered. Nate knelt down to his level, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. We're one step closer, champ. Eli smiled faintly, then reached into his crayon box and pulled out a red one. He placed it in Nate's hand. For good luck, he said. Nate stared at it, the small, worn crayon that had drawn every heart, every home, every bit of hope in that little boy's world. He nodded, voice rough. Thanks, kiddo. I'll take care of it. M. As they walked out into the gray Seattle afternoon, Catalina leaning on his arm, Eli's hand small but steady in his, Nate realized something profound. He wasn't just fighting a custody case. He was fighting for the right to finally have a family. 2 quiet weeks passed, each day softer than the one before. Seattle's rain had turned gentle, and Nate's apartment no longer felt like an empty space. It felt like home. Every morning began with pancakes and laughter. Eli sat at the counter, legs swinging, syrup on his chin. "You're getting better, Mr. Nate," he said proudly. "That's because I have the best teacher," Nate replied, smiling. They visited Catalina each afternoon. Her strength returned slowly, and so did her humor.
You're spoiling my son, Senor Papas Fritas.
She teased. Nate laughed, pretending to protest, but inside, he felt something stir, something that felt like belonging. Still, when night came, the weight returned. Nate would sit by the window after Eli fell asleep, staring at the skyline. The court's decision hung over him like the next storm. Yet in that small apartment, with the sound of a child's breathing nearby, he found peace he'd never known. One rainy night, Eli crept into his room, clutching his red crayon. "Mr. Nate, what if the judge says I have to go away?" Nate's heart clenched. He brushed the boy's hair gently. "Then I'll find you, no matter what. Promise?" "Promise." Eli smiled faintly and fell asleep, safe beneath the sound of the rain. Nate stayed awake, whispering into the dark, "Please, just let me keep my family." Midweek brought a chill that no heater could chase away. The peace they'd built began to crack when Douglas called. "Ricardo's stirring trouble," he said. "He's talking to a reporter, claiming you paid the mother to give up her son." Nate closed his eyes. "He'll destroy her reputation to get to me." At the hospital that afternoon, Catalina already knew. She sat by the window, sunlight falling across her face. "He won't stop," she said quietly. "But maybe I can." "What are you talking about?" Nate asked. She turned to him, voice steady but sad. "If the court thinks I'm unfit, they might give you full custody. Eli would be safe. That's all that matters." Nate shook his head. "Don't you dare sacrifice yourself for this. He needs you." Her eyes softened. "He needs both of us. But if one of us has to fall, let it be me." Silence hung between them, heavy as the gray light outside. Then, from the hallway, came the faint sound of Eli's laughter, innocent, unaware. Nate looked toward the door, his voice breaking. "No, we fight together." Catalina smiled faintly, tears shining. "Then promise me, Nate, no matter what happens, keep him safe." "I promise," he said. That night, he stood by Eli's bed, watching him sleep. The boy still clutched the red crayon in his hand. Outside, thunder rolled again, echoing over the sound. The storm was coming back, and this time, Nate was ready to face it. The morning of the final hearing dawned gray and silent. The city seemed to hold its breath. Nate dressed without speaking, the weight of the suit heavier than it had ever been. In the next few hours, everything could change. At the courthouse steps, Catalina waited with Eli. She looked pale but composed, a sunflower pinned to her coat, the one he and Eli had given her days ago. "For courage," she said softly when he glanced at it. Inside, the courtroom felt smaller than before. Ricardo was already there, cleaner this time, his expression smug. The air buzzed with whispers from reporters. Nate ignored them all. When the judge entered, silence fell. Douglas rose to speak, his tone steady. He presented Catalina's testimony, the medical reports, the evidence of neglect. But the part that struck hardest was when he paused and said quietly, "This case isn't about wealth. It's about who showed up when it mattered." Ricardo's lawyer tried to twist the story, calling Nate a man who bought affection. But when Catalina took the stand, her words cut through every lie. "Money didn't save my son," she said. "Love did." Nate's chest tightened. For a moment, the judge's eyes softened. She looked down at the small boy sitting quietly near the front, crayon box in hand. Eli met her gaze and whispered, "Please let me stay." No one breathed. Even Ricardo looked away. The judge closed the file. "I've heard enough," she said. "The decision will be delivered after recess." As the gavel struck, Nate exhaled shakily. It was almost over. One way or another, their fate was about to be decided. He turned toward Catalina and Eli, the sunflower bright against the gray morning. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about winning, only about keeping the promise he'd made. When the court reconvened, the air felt different, thicker, quieter. Even the reporters had stopped whispering. The judge read through the final notes, her voice steady but calm. "In the matter of custody for Eli Mendoza Reyes," she said, "the court recognizes the mother, Miss Catalina Reyes, as the child's legal guardian. However, She paused, eyes lifting toward Nate. Given the evidence and the emotional testimony presented, the court grants shared guardianship to Mr. Nathan Hollis. Catalina covered her mouth. Nate froze, not sure he'd heard correctly. This arrangement, the judge continued, ensures the child remains in a stable, loving environment supported by both adults who have proven commitment and care. The gavel fell. One simple sound, and everything changed. Eli turned toward Nate, wide-eyed. "We can stay?" Nate knelt, voice trembling. "Yeah, buddy, we can stay." The boy threw his arms around his neck, laughing through tears. Catalina joined them, her hand resting on Nate's shoulder. "You kept your promise," she whispered. Ricardo was gone before anyone noticed his empty chair left behind, like a shadow fading at last. Outside, the rain had stopped. The air smelled clean, like something beginning again. They stood together on the courthouse steps, the city stretching wide before them. Eli held their hands, one in each of his small palms, and said with a grin, "Can we get pancakes now?" Nate laughed softly. "Yeah, kiddo. Let's go home." As they walked toward the car, the sun broke through the clouds, catching on the yellow petals of the sunflower still pinned to Catalina's coat. For Nate Hollis, the man who once measured life in numbers and deals, everything suddenly made sense. Redemption hadn't come through power or money, it had come through love. And this time, he wasn't walking away. Sometimes life changes not with thunder or grand gestures, but with a single call in the middle of an ordinary day. For Nathan Hollis, it wasn't the boardroom or the bank account that defined him. It was the trembling voice of a child who reminded him what truly mattered. A man who once measured success in profit margins discovered that love, not wealth, was the only thing that could save him. In the quiet mornings that followed the court's decision, the smell of pancakes filled Nate's kitchen again, and laughter replaced the echo of loneliness. Catalina's soft hum blended with the sound of rain on the window, and Eli's crayons scattered across the table like tiny pieces of sunlight. It wasn't a perfect life, no one's ever is, but it was theirs. A home built not on marble floors or gold-plated promises, but on forgiveness, courage, and second chances. And maybe that's what redemption truly means, not erasing the past, but learning to love in spite of it. In a world obsessed with speed and noise, kindness still whispers the loudest. Like the porch light that stays on long after everyone's gone to bed, compassion quietly guides us home through the darkest nights. So tonight, if this story touched something in you, take a moment to think of someone you once walked away from, someone who might still be waiting for your call. Because happiness doesn't always come from starting over. Sometimes it comes from coming back. Love has no price tag. Forgiveness has no deadline. And family is not just who you're born to, it's who stands by you when life goes dark. Now, dear listener, tell me if this story warmed your heart. Press 1" the comments. If it didn't, or you'd like to share your thoughts, press 0. And if it reminded you of your own family, take a moment tonight to let them know. Because sometimes, one small call can change everything.